Well, another beautiful day started like so many other days in Hawaii on Saturday, January 13th of this year. People were up and about, and it seemed like just any other day. People out for their morning walks, people sipping coffee while reading their Saturday newspaper, people at the local restaurants enjoying a delicious meal, even some teeing off at the local golf course. But then everything changed. At 8:06 a.m., an emergency alert text was issued to the general public in Hawaii that said the following: ballistic missile threat inbound to Hawaii. Seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill. Just like that, everything changed for an entire state. People understandably panicked as they realized that their times here on earth may very well be coming to an end. Those things that just a few minutes earlier seemed important were now totally insignificant. Thousands of people scrambled to call and to text friends and family to tell them that they love them, or to ask for forgiveness or apologize about things that they didn't want left undone now that their lives were coming to an end. The end was near, and suddenly those things that really mattered came into focus. For 38 minutes, this continued until another text alert came out saying that there was no threat to Hawaii and that the first alert had been a mistake. How many of you remember that in the news? Well, for those 38 minutes, everybody in Hawaii was living with the end in mind. How often do we do that? How often do we live with the end in mind? Should it really take something like an imminent missile attack to make us focus on those things that really matter the most? When we look at what the Bible teaches, we realize that we are told that we should always be living our lives with the end in mind. In other words, we should always be living in a state of readiness, in a state of awareness that the end could come at any time. But we don't think that way naturally, do we? In fact, I'd guess that most of us don't really like the idea of thinking that way all the time, do we? We don't want to constantly be thinking about dying and when that might happen. But the reality is, we're all dying. The question is, how are you going to live between now and then? In James 4:14, we read these words: "What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. You don't know how much time you have left." Just a couple of weeks ago, Rachel showed me the obituary of a friend of ours from the church family that we were a part of before moving here to Goshen. Billy was 1 year older than me, and he died suddenly and unexpectedly in his home. A lot of you who have been around here for a long time, you remember last year, our friend Chris Stump, who was out on his motorcycle. A car pulled out in front of him, crash, gone. And sometimes it's not as sudden, but it still happens so quickly. I think of a family that I spent time with this year that lost their daughter, who was in her 30s, to cancer, leaving 5 children behind. I think of one of Rachel's coworkers who 2 years ago seemed so healthy, and then it was discovered that she had lung cancer with a brain tumor, and 6 months later, she was gone. I think of going down in April of this year to the retirement center in North Carolina where my parents are, and moving them from an independent home to a 2-bedroom apartment in their more advanced care center because my dad's dementia continued to get worse. And then going back again just a few weeks ago with my brothers to have to move him again, this time to the Alzheimer's dementia lockdown unit because his health is deteriorating way quicker than what was expected. None of us knows how much time we have left. Most of us live our lives assuming that we have more time than we do. But let's face it, when it comes right down to it, in the scope of eternity, whether you have 38 more minutes or 38 more years, it's still a really short period of time. So the question is, what are we doing with our time? What are we doing with our time? This series we are calling Sync is all about matching our resources with God's priorities so that we will be ready when we stand before God someday and give an account for our lives. If you brought your Bible with you today, go ahead and open up to Matthew chapter 25. Matthew is the first book in the New Testament. It's one of 4 books in the Bible that cover what happened when Jesus was here on earth. If you didn't bring your Bibles, we'll have the verses up on the screens for you. But when we read the teachings of Jesus in Matthew 25, we need to realize that they came close to the end of his earthly life and ministry. He had already talked to them about the fact that he was going to die for the sins of the world, although many still didn't understand it at that point. But here in this part of the Gospel of Matthew, he starts to talk to them about when he's going to return in the future. And Jesus is warning his followers that they will not know when it will happen, so they need to use their time now to prepare themselves so that they're ready and not caught off guard. And if we back up for just a moment to the end of Matthew chapter 24, we read these words starting in verse 42. Always be ready, because you don't know the day that your Lord will come. Remember this, if the owner of the house knew what time of night a thief was coming, the owner would watch and not let the thief break in. So you also must be ready, because the Son of Man will come at a time that you don't expect him. So what Jesus does in Matthew 25 is he gives us a few stories or parables to help unpack what this looks like to live this way, to live prepared with a watchful eye with the end in mind. So let me go ahead and read the first story in Matthew 25, and then I'll share some more insights into what it's all about, starting in verse 1. Then the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 bridesmaids who took their lamps and they went to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were wise. The 5 who were foolish didn't take enough olive oil for their lamps, but the other 5 were wise enough to take along extra oil. And when the bridegroom was delayed, they all became drowsy and fell asleep. At midnight, they were roused by the shout, "Look, the bridegroom is coming. Come out and meet him." And all the bridesmaids got up and they prepared their lamps. And then the 5 foolish ones asked the others, "Please give us some of your oil because our lamps are going out." But the others replied, "We don't have enough for all of us. Go to a shop and buy some for yourselves." But while they were gone to buy oil, the bridegroom came. And then those who were ready went in with him to the marriage feast, and the door was locked. And later, when the other 5 bridesmaids returned, they stood outside calling, "Lord, Lord, open the door for us." But he called back, "Believe me, I don't know you. So you too must keep watch, for you do not know the day or the hour of my return." Now, at that time, it was common for the bridesmaids to wait with the bride until the groom arrived. And when the word came that he was coming, they would rush outside to meet him, and they would light the path to the bride with their lamps. And they didn't know when he would come. It was part of the fun, kind of built up the anticipation level. They might wait a day, they might wait 3 or 4 days for the groom to arrive. So the story isn't about the groom's punctuality, it's about the bridesmaids' lack of preparation. Jesus is saying, this is what it's going to be like when he returns. A lot of people will look ready, but they're going to be exposed as unprepared when he shows up. It's our responsibility to be ready. And the Bible uses the analogy of the church being the bride and Jesus being the groom. We need to be in a constant state of preparedness because we don't know when the groom is going to show up. Oil was used as a form of currency at that time. It had so many uses that it was a valuable commodity. It was used for medicinal purposes. It was used as a fragrance, for funeral preparation, as a heat source, as a light source. So while some of the bridesmaids managed their resources well, others managed them foolishly. And in the end, they were exposed for their foolish ways, and they were excluded from being in the groom's presence. Now, whether it's when we die or if we're here when Jesus returns, we're going to stand before God someday, and we're going to give an account for our lives. How we lived our lives here is all the evidence God needs to know on how sincere we were in loving him and following wholeheartedly after him. And some will be found to be wise, and they will be ushered into the groom's presence for all eternity, and others will be found to be foolish, and they will be separated from him for all of eternity. When we talk about matching up our resources with God's priorities, we're talking about our money, we're talking about our skills, our talents, our passions, and our time. And I want to talk about our financial resources a little bit in light of this bigger picture idea of living with the end in mind. Now, some people get a little nervous talking about money but I don't, because it's a topic that Jesus made very clear was extremely important for us to talk about. In fact, if you look at the stories, if you look at the parables that you find in the four gospel accounts, 16 of the 38 stories that Jesus tells dealt with money and possessions. 16 out of 38. So it's obviously important. So Jesus knew how these things would compete for our loyalty and our focus in our time here on earth. And he had a lot to say to us about making sure that we keep them in their proper place as far as priorities go. Now, I'm guessing when it comes to money that quite a few of us here over the years, you've been taught to save and prepare for the future, right? Most of us have been taught that or learned that through the years. Many of us have financial advisors, or maybe we use online resources to help us plan accordingly for the future. Now, I don't know about your advisors, but I remember sitting down with my advisor once, and he started with a few basic questions. And one of those questions was, where do you like to see yourself? Where would you like to see yourself in 5 years? Anybody have that question asked when you go to something? Where would you like to see yourself in 5 years? How about 10 years? How about 20 years? And the point of that exercise was to get me thinking about what it was that we wanted then so that we could start preparing now. College tuition, weddings, early retirement, season tickets to my beloved Pittsburgh Steelers. I mean, I had a list. I had a list going on there, right? And from those answers, we looked at the financial goals that we needed to set and pursue now so that we would be ready then. So the overarching question for all of us becomes, what do you need to do now so you are ready then? That's the question Jesus is asking us when we read through Matthew 25. Whether it's when Christ returns or if you die before that happens and meet God face to face, what do you need to do now so that you are ready then when you give an account for your life? If we're going to plan, prepare, and invest for things like college and weddings and retirement, how much more should we plan and prepare and invest for eternity? Matthew 25 challenges us to think of our finances and our material possessions in light of eternity. So let's go back to those questions that some financial advisors use. How do you picture yourself 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now? Those are good questions. The only way that you can know what you need to be really focused on today is to answer those questions. Now, what if I added this question? How do you picture yourself in 3,000 years? Because you will still exist. You were created for eternity. You will shed this human suit you're wearing, but your soul will go on for eternity. So how do you picture yourself in 3,000 years? How do you picture yourself 300,000 years from now? That's a little different way of looking at things, isn't it? It puts things in a whole new perspective for us, doesn't it? The Bible teaches us that what we do with this very brief, short life has an eternal impact. And that's why we need to be reminded that the primary purpose of this life is to prepare for eternity, not simply to prepare for retirement. Maybe you've heard the story of the stockbroker and the genie. A genie came to a stockbroker and told him that he had one wish. And the stockbroker thought for a minute, and then he wished for a newspaper from 1 year to the day in the future. The genie granted his wish. The stockbroker knew exactly what he was going to do. He turned to the stock index of the paper, and then he spent numerous hours planning his investment strategy so that he could clean up in the market and be set for life. And when he was finished, he sat back and sipped on his coffee and decided to look at the rest of the newspaper simply for amusement purposes. He read the front page articles, he read the sports section, he read the classifieds, and then he found himself in the obituaries. And there was a name that caught his attention. And he went on to read about his own death that would take place 1 year into the future. And suddenly, just like that, his investment strategy changed drastically. Suddenly, his plans for the next year were very, very different. Why? Because he was filtering everything through the lens of having the end in mind. Jesus would challenge us to live with this mindset of always keeping the end in mind. It's why he teaches us in Matthew 6, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moths and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moths and vermin do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. In other words, stop spending so much time focused on building up your earthly portfolio that you forget to address your eternal portfolio. Look at what Paul says in 1 Timothy 6. Tell those who are rich not to be proud and not to trust in their money, which will soon be gone, but their pride and trust should be in the living God, who always richly gives us all that we need for our enjoyment. Tell them to use their money to do good. They should be rich in good works and should give happily to those in need, always being ready to share with others whatever God has given them. By doing this, they will be storing up real treasures for themselves in heaven. It is the only safe investment for eternity, and they will be a living, fruitful Christian life down here as well. What we do with our money and possessions now has a huge implication and long-term implication. Earlier we asked ourselves what we will do with the time that we have left here on earth. And when it comes to thinking about our finances specifically, maybe the question to ask ourselves is this: what could I do without now so that I can better match up my resources with God's priorities? What could I do without now so that I can better match up my resources with God's priorities? What could I sacrifice now so that I will be better in line with God's priorities for my finances? The national average saving rate is like 0.2%, which means that we spend 99.8% of what we earn pretty quickly. And that doesn't even reflect the millions who spend far beyond the full 100% and are in debt up to their eyeballs with credit card debt. We are so short-sighted in seeing the true value of money. Let's take an example of getting coffee today. How many coffee drinkers do we have? Lots of coffee drinkers. How many of you already had more than one cup today? Some of you are shaking a little bit, so I kind of figured. So let's say it costs $3.50 for a cup of coffee. Go to one of your coffee places, all right? $3.50. That's $105 a month. That's about $1,260 a year. But if instead you invested that money in a mutual fund that made, say, around 6% annually, after 30 years, you would have $106,000. The benefit of that exercise is so the next time you get your coffee, you don't see a cup of coffee that's $3.50. You see a cup of coffee that's $106,000. Right? What happens as a result of that? As a result of thinking with the end in mind, you will value that money now differently. Does that make sense? When we think about things with the end in mind, it drastically changes how we view things. And today, of course, we're focusing more specifically on our finances. The Bible uses the same idea to teach us about sacrificing now for later. Jesus says this in Matthew 19:29. Anyone who sacrifices home, family, fields, whatever, because of me, will get it all back 100 times over. Not to mention the considerable bonus of eternal life. Now, he's talking here about the riches of heaven, but he's using terminology that we can wrap our heads around to make the comparison. Guys, that's a 10,000% rate of return. That's pretty good. Why wouldn't I talk about money with you? What kind of a friend or a pastor would I be if I knew about something that you could get a 10,000% rate of return on and didn't tell you about it? A pastor was telling the story about a mission fundraise dinner that he attended. He sat at the table with leaders who were sponsoring the event, along with those influential speakers that would be addressing the crowd. And one of the speakers was a gentleman who was a well-known businessman in the area, and he was a multimillionaire. He shared about his first job in college in landscaping. He got paid cash at the end of each day. And after 4 days, he had a total of $80 to his name. And he went to church that Wednesday evening, and there was a missionary there sharing about some of the financial needs in the mission field. And this man felt convicted that he was supposed to give God everything that he had. He was supposed to give away all of his money. So he took the $80 and he put it in the offering basket. And he went on to share that since then, God had blessed him far and above and beyond in so many ways. And as he returned to the table, he sat down across from an older lady who had just spent most of her life in the mission field. And her eyes met his eyes, and she said just loud enough for him to hear, "I dare you to do it again. I dare you to do it again." $80 is one thing. Millions of dollars is something else, isn't it? What can you possibly do or buy with your money now that can match a 10,000% rate of return by using it instead to pour into those things that matter the most to the heart of God? Let's use and spend our money with the end in mind, with eternity in mind. What does that look like for us? I spend time with my oldest daughter, Kirsten, talking about money sometimes. She got her first job, turned 15 this year, so she got her first job, and she's a dining attendant over at Greencroft. So she gets her paycheck every 2 weeks. So you can imagine how excited she was, especially when she got that first paycheck, right? All right, now she's just raking in the dough, right? So, and I use this example because a teenage girl's budget is a little more simplified than our budgets as adults, right? 15-year-old teenage girl's budget is clothing, makeup, nails, hanging out with friends, clothing, right? That's like that's kind of like your typical budget at that point. In fact, when she came in this morning, because I told her, I said, "Hey, when you get here, I want to check with you because I want to tell a story about you. I want to make sure that's okay." And true to form, she walked in and had her app open for Hollister and was looking through, figuring out what next shirt she wanted to buy. So, all right. But we all have that, right? We all have those things in our budget that are just the things that we like. That's what we do. This is for me, this is for me, this is for me, this is for me. But one of the things that I love about her heart is she wanted to be involved with our ministry with Kids Alive. Rachel and I were just down in the Dominican last month, and we sponsor 5 children at the orphanage that are down there, and we've gotten to know these girls so well over the last 5 years. And we have our youngest daughter is 5 years old, and Kirsten wanted to sponsor a little boy that was the same age as her little sister. So we found little 5-year-old Kelvin at the orphanage, and she is now on her own sponsoring Kelvin. And the reason I tell that is this. Because, again, the simplified budget just helps us to process this. Think about these other things we talked about. Okay, clothing, hanging out with friends, makeup, nail, all that kind of stuff. We all have that stuff in our budget, and it's all stuff, it's just gone, right? You get a dollar for dollar return on that stuff. You spend it, you get the dollar, in value back. It's over with. But what God's word is telling us is that $39 a month that Kirsten is putting towards sponsoring a child is getting a 10,000% rate of return on it in eternity. So what's the most significant money that's being used on a regular basis? Any light bulbs going on? Are we seeing the difference here? The stuff that we invest, the money that we use in our budgets that goes towards those things that matter the most to the heart of God, that is earning you a 10,000% rate of return in eternity. And when you think with the end in mind, that is a no-brainer, isn't it? That is a no-brainer. Because we're not talking about where you're going to be in 5, 10, and 20 years. We're also talking about where you're going to be 3,000 years from now, where you're going to be 300,000 years from now. And it's about storing up treasures in heaven. And if I can spend $1 here in something that matters to God and know that that's storing up treasures in the heaven 100 times over, yeah, you betcha. Live with the end in mind. Live with the bigger picture of eternity in mind. Live with the understanding of what it is that is the highest priority for how you use your resources. And when we get that, when our minds finally start to wrap around that, your money is naturally going to come in sync with the things that matter most to the heart of God. When we live our lives and we use our financial resources with that bigger end picture in mind, it allows us to live more open-handed. I mean, let's be honest about that. We have times with our money that we're very much like this, aren't we? Very much like, no, this is mine, right? That's how we get. We just get very self-absorbed, very selfish. How do I get more? And this is how we live with our finances. But God's saying, if you get this bigger picture, if you understand that putting your money in those things that matter the most to me is going to long-term for eternity pay back in such bigger dividends, it allows us to live our lives financially like this. I see a need, I meet a need. This is something that matters to the heart of God. I'm investing in this. I'm putting money into this. And we live our lives with open hands. When we live our lives and we use our financial resources with a bigger end picture in mind, it allows us to desire to find ways to sacrifice now and give towards kingdom work. I was reading a story the other day. It was about, the average person, they say right now, you have in your house stuff that you just really don't use. The average person has about $2,000 worth of stuff easily in your house that you could go around right now and figure out, don't use this, don't use this, don't use this, don't use this, turn around and sell that stuff and make like $2,000. That's like the average in America. You believe that? See some definite nodding. Becky, you're 4,000 or 5,000 evidently the way you're nodding your head over there. So, all right. But think about how you could be intentional with that. You could do that now. You could decide one of the things you want to do right now is, God, I want to get creative in how I'm going to give to things that matter to the heart of you. Today, I'm going to go home. I'm going to start looking around my house. I'm going to find those things that I don't need, that I don't use. I mean, my gosh, there's so many ways online you can sell things now, right? And community forums and all that kind of stuff. I'm going to sell this stuff. I'm going to get this money, and I'm going to put it towards something that matters to the heart of God. That's something you could do this week. You could be intentional with increasing your giving over time. I was talking with a friend from church here, and we were talking about money and giving a while back, and they were just sharing the story of how they've trusted God and how that has built up over time, and that they saw that 10%. That's for them. That was the beginning point. Scripture teaches about giving our tithe, but as we grow in our understanding of who God is and recognize the blessings He gives us, that number should just kind of keep creeping up to the point where now they're at a place where they're giving 22%. You can do that when you have open hands. When you see money and life in the scope of eternity and the big picture of God's priorities. When you live with the end in mind, you start asking different questions. You don't ask the question, hey, what's the most we can spend? That question changes. Instead, it becomes, hey, what's the least that we can spend so that we can use the rest for kingdom purposes? There was a pastor that was telling a story about a very wealthy couple from their church that years before had decided that where they were income-wise, when they were early on in their married life, that was what they were just going to continue to live on. Cost of living, they would account for that, but they were just going to continue to live on that. And everything beyond that, through all the years, all their raises, all of that stuff, everything was going to be given towards kingdom purposes. And later in life, the pastor approached them and just said, hey, would you mind sharing with me a little bit about what that looks like tangibly for you? He said, sure, I'd be happy to do that. So what was that number? What was that number you were at? You guys both have good jobs. What was that at? He goes, we both work full-time. We're both professionals. So when we were at about $80,000, we decided that's our budget from now on for the rest of our lives. That, cost of living, that's going to be our budget. He said, would you mind telling me what you both actually make now? He said, I'd be happy to tell you that. We make about $350,000. So you're telling me that years ago you decided when you were at the 80 that everything above that from now on was going to go towards kingdom purpose things. He said, yep, we decided we can live on this easily enough. So over the years, we went from that gap between $80,000 and $350,000 that they made, all went to investing in kingdom purpose. I wonder what that would look like for us. Now, those numbers are crazy numbers for most of us in here, okay? But is there a place that you can look at your budget and finally go, you know what? We can live on this. Because what's our tendency? You get raises, what do? Every area across your budget goes up, right? We get bigger houses, we get nicer cars, nicer property, maybe we get a rental, maybe we get a boat, maybe, whatever it is. When our income goes up, we just start upping our spending in all these different areas. So what would that look like for you to go, you know what, God? You have blessed us so much. This is where we're going to draw a line. That we can live and take care of ourselves here. And we're going to start taking this above and beyond, and we're going to start intentionally putting that towards things that have a bigger purpose and that are near and dear to your heart. What would that look like? Maybe that's speaking to somebody today. But let's look at our finances and our resources with the ends in mind. Let's go back in closing. That initial story I told you about in Hawaii, that ballistic missile warning. They interviewed some people afterwards, and this was weeks afterwards that I was reading this one article, and one of the guys was talking about how thankful he was that that happened. Because he said if that hadn't happened, he would have never been forced to be in a position where he had to really think about what mattered the most. And he had noticed in that month since that event happened that his life had taken a drastic turn, because now he was laser focused on what mattered the most. Let's not wait for some drastic event like that to figure out what matters the most. God's word tells us what matters the most. We're going to be talking about more of that throughout this 5-week series. But let's be intentional now to give God our finances and say, God, hey, help me do this. I do not have this organized like you would like to see this organized. So help us figure this out. Help us figure out what's reasonable for us to live off of, but then show us those things that matter the most to you and help us to invest in those, because that 10,000% rate of return for eternity, man, I want to be part of that. God wants us to be part of that. So let's keep that in focus. You're on limited time here. Make it count, not just for now, but for all of eternity. Go hard with God with your finances and your resources, and store up treasures where it matters the most. Let's pray. God, thank you for the opportunity to dive into this series. Because, God, we are people who need constant reminders to keep us on track. At least I know I am. It's so easy to go through our day-to-day lives and just get consumed with the things that are on our priority list and lose sight of those things that are on your priority list. And ideally, God, we want that list to be one and the same. So God, would you work in our hearts, would you work in our minds and in our souls, so that the things that are on your top priority list are the same things that are at the top of our list as well. God, we live in a culture that is excessive in so many ways. And it's so easy for us to look around ourselves and to play the comparison game with everybody that we see on a daily basis. And when we see all the stuff that everybody has, it's really easy for us to just kind of go down that path and going, oh man, I need to get some of that too. God, we don't want to play that game. It's not a game that matters to you. It's not a priority that matters to you. So God, would you help us to find that balance of doing a good job of taking care of ourselves, which we know that's honoring to you to do that, and to take care of our families and loved ones as well. But God, we know we can do it without going as excessive as many of us do. We want to invest in those things that matter to you. God, would you stir in our hearts today? It's one of the many things I love about you, Lord, is that you are stirring in each of our hearts for different passions and different talents and different skill sets, and there's probably something different for each one of us that you want us to get out of today's message and worship time. So God, I just pray that you do what only you can do. Would you show up in our hearts and in our minds this week? And would you stir? Would you stir us up to be the people that you have called us to be? Would you stir us up, Lord, to look at our finances with a fresh perspective? Not just thinking about 5 years from now, but thinking about 300,000 years from now. And how we want to be invested in those things that matter to you. God, I thank you for this church family. I thank you for their hearts and desire to follow after you. And I trust that you will honor the words that have been spoken today, that you will lead us in a new direction, down a new path, so that we get this particular area of our lives more in sync with your plan for us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thank you so much for being here for week number 1 of Sync. Next week, we have some special guests. Joining me on stage next week is going to be the members of our youth group and the adult leaders who went on their mission trip to the Dominican Republic in June. And we're going to be talking with them a little bit about getting in sync with those things that matter the most to the heart of God. So make sure you're here next week as we get to invite them up here with me as well. If you'd like some prayer, please join our prayer team over here in the corner. They would love to pray you up for this week and give you some guidance if you have any questions on next steps maybe in your faith journey of what God is calling you to do. And if you don't have anything going on for the next 3 hours, Dar is doing a taco bar out at her place. If you've got your swimsuits, feel free to bring those over, do some cannonballs with us, and join us as our family is celebrating. If you weren't here last Sunday, the Friday before that, we finalized our adoption of our 3 girls. So we are thrilled about that. We'd love to be able to celebrate that with you. So if you don't have a lot going on, 12 to 3, go to Dar's house. If you need the address, there's a card at the FYI counter. So have a great week. We'll see you next week for week number 2 of Sync.